I call John Boscawen.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Yesterday we heard from the Prime Minister outlining the government's plan for the year, and he touched on a number of areas, and I'd like to focus just on one of them if I can this afternoon. He talked about the possibility of increasing the rate of GST from 12.5% to 15%. And what did we hear from the opposition? One after one, we heard Phil Goff, Annette King, David Cunliffe, Shane Jones, all standing up and pretending to be concerned for those people on low incomes. Pretending to be concerned for those people on low incomes. From Phil Goff, we heard about the person on the minimum wage who will pay more for their bread, their milk, their power and their block of cheese. From David Cunliffe, he said, and I quote, "They are right to be sceptical that they'll be not fully compensated. The mum who is trying to feed 3 or 5 kids on a medium or low income, frightened about the cost of her bread, milk, let alone her power. Well, it's interesting. I didn't hear Mr Mallard's introduction, but Mr Mallard was one member of the previous government who actually voted for a tax on power. He voted for a tax on power, and if the people of New Zealand had not had the good sense to change the government, to vote for a change of government 15 months ago, electricity would have gone up in this country on the 1st of January this year. That's right, Mr Mallard, that's right. We would have had a 10% increase in the price of electricity from the 1st of January, You may not like to hear it, you may not like to hear that criticism, but that's exactly what would have happened. That's what the people of New Zealand voted for in November 2008. They voted against an increase, a tax on electricity. Electricity would have gone up by 10% on the 1st of January this year. And so when Mr Goff stands up and talks about the mother, the person having to meet the cost of her bread, her milk, the power and the block of cheese, Mr Goff is misleading all New Zealanders because he and his colleagues voted for an admissions trading scheme tax that would have increased the price of electricity by 10% on the 1st of January this year, 5% on the price of petrol, and those increases would have percolated throughout the whole economy. We would have had increases in food. You know, we have David Cunliffe talking about the block of cheese. Well, sir, it requires electricity to manufacture a block of cheese. Farmers have to have milk. They produce milk. That goes into a block of cheese. The Labour government, the former Labour government, was the first government in the world, sir, was the first government in the world to put a tax on its farmers. A tax on its farmers, tax on cows, on animals, for doing what they do naturally, which is to burp, sir, and to digest food. And the Labour Party, one after one, yesterday, stood up there yesterday afternoon and talked about the price of electricity going up and pretended to be concerned about low-income people. That's right, pretended to be concerned about low-income people. Because if they were concerned about the price of electricity, I asked Leanne Dalziel, why would have you voted for an emissions trading scheme that would increase the price of electricity by 10%? Sir, amendments were made to that scheme last year. And what do we have as a consequence? Well, sir, the good news is we don't have a tax on going on electricity of 10%. The good news, it'll only be 5%. It'll only be 5%, and it will be going on 6 months later on the 1st of July this year. So we can thank the National Party for agreeing to halve the increase in the rate of price of electricity, and delay its introduction. But I ask, why are we allowing electricity to go up in the first place? Why do we come here and make speeches and pretend to be concerned about people on low income, knowing fully well that we're prepared to see significant increases in the price of electricity? The interesting thing about the increase in GST is the Prime Minister made it very clear yesterday that those people on low income will be compensated. He'll be increasing the rates of New Zealand superannuation. He'll be making sure that those people who are most affected by the increase in GST, because it takes the largest proportion of incomes, are fully compensated. Was there any compensation for the low-income people who would have faced a 10% increase in the price of electricity from the Labor government on the 1st of January this year? No, there was not. No, there was not. And sadly, Mr. Speaker, I actually have to say that the National Party also is making no compensation for those low-income people who will be having to pay the increase in electricity from the 1st of July this year. And so Mr Cunliffe talked about people being sceptical. Well, the Prime Minister made the point. He made the point very well that they'll be fully compensating people for the increase in the price of GST, or the increase in the rate of GST. I ask why we actually have to increase the price of electricity. And if we are to increase the price of electricity, what about compensation for those people who have to pay for that? Sir, I raised this issue of the emissions trading scheme tax, or the ETS tax, sir, because we were told by the Minister of Climate Change last year that we had to have that. We had to have a tax in place before he went off to the Copenhagen climate change talks. We had to have that. We had to keep pace with Australia. We were told that our scheme, our emissions trading scheme tax, was going to be consistent with the scheme that the Australian government was going to pass, and he was so convinced, the Minister of Climate Change, that the Australian government would pass the scheme before the end of November so the Australians could go off to Copenhagen with their tax in their bag. Well, sir, there is no emissions trading scheme in Australia. That proposal was defeated. New Zealand is the only country in the world, it's the only country in the world outside of Europe to have an emissions trading scheme. It's the only country in the world to tax its farmers. Less than 6 months ago, sir, the Minister of Climate Change sat in his seat there in the front row and gladly told and proudly told the parliamentarians and the people of New Zealand that the Alcan aluminium smelter at Camelto would be the first aluminium smelter in the world to be taxed. The first aluminium smelter that would be bearing the costs of an emissions trading scheme. And we wonder why we have problems creating job opportunities in New Zealand. We wonder why we have problems creating job opportunities in New Zealand. But sir, it's worse than that, because not only did Australia not introduce an emissions trading scheme, or in fact it introduced it, but it couldn't pass it. In fact, it introduced it, I understand it's been introduced into the Australian Parliament for the 3rd time, but is expected to be defeated. Sir, we've also heard over the last 3 months a total lack of credibility from the International Panel on Climate Change. First of all, we heard in November that climate data had been manipulated, had been hidden. Our own NIWA, our National Institute on Water and Air, has also adjusted New Zealand's climate change data and can't show records or doesn't have adequate proof of the adjustments made, despite constant requests from that. The IPCC, sir, the supposedly reputed scientific body that tells the world that we're warming, made the claim that the glaciers in the Himalayas will be melted by 2035. 25 years those glaciers would be melting. And so we've learned over the Christmas vacation that they made a mistake. Supposedly a peer-reviewed document that the glaciers in the Himalayas won't have melted by 2035. It'll be 2300 if it's that. Sir, the ACT Party stands alone in this House. We're the only party who recognise that this is a country of 2 classes of citizens. We've got the privileged and we've got the underprivileged. We've got the people who pay tax and the people who avoid paying tax, sir. There is a chance to introduce genuine tax reform into this country. The Prime Minister is only laying out the bare bones of it in what he did. This country needs to go further. But sir, I was very interested to hear from John Howard, former Prime Minister of Australia, when he visited to attend the ACT conference in November, when he said he and his Liberal colleagues used to sit on the other side of the Tasman and look in awe and wonderment at New Zealand's GST because it was so inclusive. And so we have a chance to make some major tax reform, and all I ask is that the opposition who sit opposite can actually speak more honestly and talk more honestly